What's up, YouTube? This week's video is about an experiment that I just ran with some of my street photography. And the experiment was to try out the 1/4 stop and the 1/8 of a stop Black Pro Mist filter and see if using them for my street photography here in New York would add a little bit more of a film-like quality to the images. Now, these filters are super popular for filmmakers, especially here on YouTube, and independent filmmakers and just generally filmmakers of all kinds. And I actually have one on the lens right now as I'm filming this video. But the purpose of this week's video is to compare two sets of images that I made over the course of 2 days here in New York, and just talk about what I liked about each of the filters, what I didn't like about each of them, and if and how I could see possibly integrating them into my workflow for street photography in the future. So with that, let's jump right in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, why I even decided to do this experiment in the first place. You see, the longer I've been doing this, the less post-processing I really want to have to do, particularly on my sort of street and travel photography. Working with models and doing fashion shoots is a totally different animal, and there's a lot that goes into getting the texture of a model's skin right and the light perfect, etc., making sure that the tones are exactly the way that they need to be to match the real-life sense of the garment, etc. But for my street and travel photography, which I almost entirely shoot in black and white, my workflow is pretty simple. I shoot raw images using the monochrome profile within my camera. I export them into Lightroom when I'm done shooting. I, maybe tweak the tone curves just a tiny bit, drop the blacks down. I usually also pull the clarity slider down quite a bit, -20 or even -30 in some cases, because I don't like the super, digitally crisp, sharp edges that the modern sensors, particularly in cameras like the one that I have, are able to produce. Maybe add a little bit of grain, maybe add back a little bit of texture, but that's really it. I try to get the images right in camera as much as I can, and by looking through the viewfinder or looking at the screen on the back and already having the camera set to the monochrome profile, I can usually pretty much visualize if an image is or isn't going to work. And maybe this is a function of knowing what I like to shoot more and having gotten in more of the reps over time, if you will, of knowing my equipment better, of knowing the way that light works better, of knowing the capabilities of the cameras that I'm using and the lenses that I'm using. All of those things together, making it that much, I don't want to say easier, but more realistic, that I can get as close to possible, in camera to the images that I'm looking to get without having to do a ton of post-processing work. So the idea of adding a diffusion filter to the front of the camera or to the lens was something that I was curious about, because there's a lot of content on YouTube right now, in particular about sort of the magic of the Black Pro Mist filters and how they really can, soften your highlights and decrease some of that extra digital sharpness. And so I was curious to just see, given the types of sort of high contrast settings that I tend to shoot, if those Pro Mist filters would actually be helpful to me, or if they would be sort of a waste of time for the style of photos that I like to take for my street and travel photography. And a big piece of this is also because in the last year, I've really leaned back into shooting a lot of film work. And, film, there's obviously still an editing process. And, if you were to be developing your film and then using a darkroom to actually make gelatin prints, for example, you would be dodging and burning, you'd be doing multiple versions of this. But really, for today's modern workflow, without a darkroom for the processing version of it, yes, you still need to develop the film. But in terms of scanning the files in and sort of manipulating them afterwards, for me, there's not a lot that I do for film. You choose the stock that you like, typically because it's got qualities that you find interesting. So if you're shooting black and white, maybe you're going for, HP5, you're looking at, Delta 3200, or you're looking at one of the Kodak stocks, that all have different qualities. Some of them are punchier and have more contrast. Some of them have different senses of grain. If you're working in color, maybe you like Portra, or maybe you like, Ektar for different color profiles. But the point is that in film, the end result is largely determined, or in part determined, by the film stock that you choose and the qualities of that film lens. In digital, we have more of a blank slate, more of a tabula rasa, where we get to sort of decide where the images are going to end. And as I've shot more film over the course of the past year or so, the more I have appreciated that what you shoot is sort of what you get from an end product with film. And I've been trying to replicate that with my street and travel work in digital as much as possible. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about how I set this experiment up for myself. Most importantly, I set the aperture consistently to 5.6 for all the images that I made. And this is important because I didn't want there to be differences in the amount of background blur present by using, 1.8 or 2.8 in some of the shots, and then f8 or f16, for example, in some of the other shots. Using different apertures would really make it hard to compare the way that the light was softened, the way that the focus was softened in some cases. No, it would not necessarily affect the blooming of highlights, but it would affect the ability of the image to be in or out of focus in terms of the depth of field and the depth of focus for those. So that's the most important thing to know about how this was set up. The other thing is that I shot one afternoon at sunset and one morning at sunrise, sort of back to back. Everything was shot on a 35mm lens using the same camera. So yes, while sunset and sunrise do technically have slightly different qualities to the light, because I was shooting this monochromatically in black and white, that was not as important to me. What was important was that I was able to get low-lying sunlight that could create silhouettes and really high contrast scenes to really test the ability of the lens to react with the different filters and give me end results. Now, I sort of graded this experiment with 4 sets of criteria. The first was the overall effect. So did I like it or not? How intense was the effect of the filter itself? Did I find it pleasing? Did it enhance or did it detract from the images that I was making? What was sort of my overall impression, sort of holistically, of the filter on the images that I was making? The second was the way that the light was diffused across the entire frame itself, or what I've sort of been calling a gray wash. So as you'll see in some of these images, depending on the strength of the light or the angle of the light, because there is a filter with pieces of sort of dark material built into it, the way that the light can actually cover the entire frame and create sort of a bit of a haze in a way that is not necessarily diffusing, just the highlights, for example, but rather is obscuring the entire frame, was something that I was looking at. The third was sort of the blooming of the highlights themselves, and the ability of the lens to still capture detail within highlight areas and the size of that bloom itself, which also relates to the fourth criteria, which is sort of related, but I was looking at them a little bit separately, and that is halation. And halation is a term that really comes from film, and it's about the way that light bounces back and forth between layers of film. So there are certain film stocks that have really pronounced halations, and on film, this typically looks like kind of a red halo around light sources. You see this in a lot of 80s movies, for example, but a lot of filmmakers use it stylistically. In photography, Cinestill is really famous for having halations present on their film, but as a sort of quality of these filters, I did want to look and see the relationship between both the bloom of the highlights and then sort of the size of the halation itself, if I found them pleasing. And then the other thing I want to note is also that none of these photos have been edited for style. They're pretty much right out of the camera. I haven't adjusted, exposure or blacks. I haven't added in any grain. I haven't touched the clarity slider. They're all exactly as is right out of camera. Okay, so on this first image, I think that there's a really strong sense of diffused light throughout the frame, but you can see here, and this is on the quarter stop, so the more intense of the two filters, that the light itself is really kind of carrying across the filter and being diffused across the entire frame. So it is adding a really sort of, soft, almost pleasing sense to the sun itself in the upper right-hand sort of corner of the frame. But if you look at, for example, the shadows coming off of the women in the left-hand corner of the frame, you see that they're more gray than black. Now, yes, this could be fixed, and as I make this comment on many of the photos, again, because they're unedited, I could easily drop the blacks down in post-processing and restore some of that. But to me, what I really see here is that the sun itself in the upper right-hand corner, because of the strength of the filter, really is obscuring most of the detail around it. The size of the bloom around the sun itself as a light source, because it is so intense and relatively low to the ground, is creating really a strong sense of that gray wash across the entire frame. Now the second image here was taken at nearly the same spot, and what I thought was useful about comparing the first image to the second image is here, the sun is actually behind the trunk of this tree. And so the blacks in this image, because the sun is not shooting directly into the lens and the filter, the blacks are much deeper here. The effect here is much more pleasing overall because there's still a lot of detail left in the shadows that wouldn't require dropping the blacks down in quite the same way. But you can see, and this is where the blooming of the highlights becomes really, I think, noticeable, and you start to see how the light wraps around the trunk of the tree. This is a quality of these diffusion filters. I find that in this particular case, it's a little distracting because it's just pretty intense, and our eye would not necessarily see it in quite that manner. But the thing that I do like about this, and a note for myself were I to use the quarter stop in the future, is that it is a pretty effective filter for softening the overall focus and feel of the image and the quality of light throughout the frame, as long as the light source is not directly making contact with the lens. In this case, it's obscured to a degree by the trunk of the tree, and that to me actually enhances the ability of the filter to create a more pleasing effect for the rest of the highlights as opposed to graying out the rest of the image. Now, this third image, I think, is one of the more pleasing of this first set of the quarter stops. Now, I metered this for the highlight, so you can be exposing for the shadows, you can be exposing for the highlights. I exposed for the highlight in this case, or that strong reflective point on those two buildings of the sun, which gave me a much darker sense of shadow on the rest of the images. Now, what I think is nice about this is because the point of reflection is so far away, at this point it's probably a mile away from where I was standing on those skyscrapers, the bloom of that highlight, while it is fairly intense and there's no detail left in that white area, it is not taking over the image in a way that we saw in the very first image of the women sort of walking in the park. So yes, even though the light is reflecting directly into the lens, it's far enough away, and therefore the source is small enough that the effect of it on the overall image is that it has created sort of a nice soft sense of light that is sort of gently filtering across the rest of the image. So this to me is a really nice effect. And again, one of the learnings for me, if I were to use the quarter stop in the future, is that, if I am going to be using a direct light source, having it further away or smaller is going to make this filter a little bit more effective. When it's more intense or close to the lens itself, the effect is a little bit too pronounced, and I find it a little bit distracting. Now, you can see sort of down in the tree line that because there's a filter here, there is a bit of reflected light down there. And if you were to zoom in, you will actually see that it's actually capturing the reflection of some of the architecture from the tall building there. But it's not that distracting to me. But I did just want to point out that because there's an additional level or layer of glass in front of the lens now, some of that light is being reflected onto that. So you're starting to get layers of reflections within the shot itself. Now, this next shot I find actually really pleasing, and part of this is because the intensity of the light is a little bit less. Yes, the light source is fairly large and it is fairly direct, like it was in that first shot of the women in Central Park and the light source. But because this was made about an hour later, the sun was nearly setting, just going down that line of trees and buildings in the distance right across the river. And because of that, the intensity of the light itself was a little bit less. And so the effect on this photo is actually relatively pleasing to me. It's softening the overall image itself. So the grays of these trains and of the fence that I'm shooting through, all of that is sort of nice and soft. And yes, there is a bit of a sort of a wash across the entire image of that gray diffused light, but I don't find it to be super distracting here in the way that I did in the first image. And my sort of hypothesis on this is because the sun was less intense than it was an hour before, where it was sort of in less atmosphere, if you will. It was shining more directly with less interference from the atmosphere around it. Now, this is where you start to see halations, and on film, where you would see this on this food cart is if you look at those neon lights and those man-made lights, how they each have almost like a bit of like a smoke around them. Now, this image I find to be relatively pleasing to my eye, but the problem with this image is if you look at the building in the background on the top right-hand corner of this frame, that's actually like a giant white wall that is reflecting the sun. And you can see here that the effect of that reflection is that there is no detail in that building reflecting back towards us. So that area has lost all of its detail, and while the food truck itself and the lights of that are stylistic and I find them attractive, the brightness of that light source in the background I find distracting. So again, a similar learning to the other photos for me of this quarter stop set is to understand that if I've got a really bright, really intense source of light that's coming right towards the camera, that the contrast can be a little bit distracting to my eye in comparison to the rest of this frame, which is fairly well exposed, and I actually like the effect that this filter has on those neon lights quite a bit. Okay, so now this image of a street on the Upper West Side is a really great example of the intensity that the quarter stop adds to the sort of effect of halation when you look at the headlights of the cars at the end of this block, or the street light sort of in the mid right-hand side of the frame, or even to the other sort of street lights and lamps that you can see on the left-hand side of the frame. There's a really intense, large sort of circle or halo of light around each of these man-made sources in a way that I find to be way too stylized and pronounced. I could certainly see the utility of this for certain types of photos. It's definitely a style, and if you were making a film or making a set of photos that were meant to evoke a certain mood, particularly if you were looking to replicate sort of a foggier, mistier sort of sense of atmosphere, I could see this being really helpful. But given that this was a pretty clear, evening, I personally find that the effect of the halation here with the quarter stop filter is way, way, way too much. If I could back that down a little bit, it might be more pleasing, but to me, it's way too much. You can barely see what's going on at the end of the block, and while some might prefer that or like that, to me it's a little bit too much in this particular case. It looks fake. It doesn't look like something that my eye would capture naturally. So my overall impressions of the quarter stop are that it can be a really great filter to use as long as one of two things is happening. A, that the light source, if it is direct, is far enough away or small enough that it's not going to overtake the entire image. And the reason that I say this is because in the shots that I showed where the sun was bright and close or seemed large, the intensity of the light really overpowered much of the shadow and the darks throughout the rest of the image. In the shots where the sun was either further away, it was less intense, or was obscure, like in the case of that tree, the effect was much more pleasing. You get a nice sort of sense of the highlights wrapping around some of the objects. There's an overall softness and texture to the image, but generally I think that I found that the quarterstop is too strong for my personal taste in most situations. So I would struggle to find a reason to use this and incorporate this into my workflow on a regular basis. Okay, so now let's talk about the 8th stop filter. I shot this the following morning after I did the quarter stop, which was done at sunset. So these sets of images were taken just after sunrise. Similar setting, also sort of in and around Central Park. So let's jump into a couple of the images and I'll give you my impressions. Okay, so this first image, and again, this is with the 8th stop, I think it does add a nice softness to the sunlight. There's a noticeable bloom. It's not as overpowering as the quarter stop. For example, if we were to compare this to the shot of the women sort of walking up the path in Central Park, that one was really, really grayed out with sort of the diffused light across the entire frame. You still see that here, but it's not quite as intense. The blacks are a little bit deeper. The lights, there's still detail within them. So overall, I think that the effect when shooting directly into a stronger sort of light source that's very intense is a little less pronounced here, and I could see using it in more cases. But let's look at a couple more images and sort of get those impressions. So here again, this is looking at a similar image, but where the light is diffused or obscured a little bit by those tree branches, not as much as in the example that I shot in Central Park the day before with that quarter stop. But in this case, you can see that even just adding a little bit of that obscuring of the light via the tree trunk that's in the background is giving us more detail in the shadows. So there still is a nice softening of the highlights. It's really blooming across sort of all of those tree branches, but it's not overpowering the image in the same way. I can see almost pure blacks on the left-hand side of the image and the blacks of the pants of the man to the right-hand side. So I find that in this case, similar to with the quarter stop, when there's either a way to obscure the light a little bit or to not shoot directly into it, the effect is a little bit less pronounced. Now, this is an example of where I think the filter does a really nice job. So yes, I'm shooting directly into a bright light source here with that 1/8 of a stop, but there's a lot of contrast in this scene. And because the filter itself is being diffused through those branches of the trees, there are a couple of really nice things that are happening to my eye that I quite like the effect and feels almost a little bit filmic to me. So the first thing that I sort of want to point out is the highlights of the branches in the trees at the top of the frame, particularly the top left hand of the frame. You can see the difference between the illuminated leaves and the darker leaves, and the sort of way that the light is wrapping around those illuminated leaves is not quite as severe as it would be without the filter on. It's very, very soft, and the light that's coming from the actual sun itself coming through those branches is very, very soft. There's still a roundness to it, but you can still nearly see the shape of the sun itself. There is a really strong sense of contrast underneath that bridge there, and what's really nice about using the filter for an image like this is that I'm still retaining a lot of those deeper, darker areas of shadow coming off of these people underneath the bridge and their silhouettes and shadows. So yes, shooting directly into a very bright light source, but again, having something to sort of diffuse that a little bit before the light hits the lens and the filter itself, I find is decreasing the overall effect of the filter in a positive way. So there is a really nice sense of fall off on the highlights throughout the image, but I'm still able to retain a lot of the detail in those darker areas that if I were to add a little bit of grain and texture to the image in post-processing would probably give me an image that I would be really, really happy with. Now compare that to this image where the light is coming through a little bit more strongly. So I took a step, a little bit to the left and a little bit forward. I'm a little bit closer to the bridge. And so there was a more direct line to the sun coming through those branches. And you can see here that while I still do have a fairly strong sense of contrast, particularly up in the trunk of the tree on the left-hand side, the detail of the bridge itself and the sort of bushes down around the path closer to the bottom of of the frame are more grayed out, and they've lost, not detail, but they've lost intensity or dark saturation in a way that the image before that didn't have. So again, I think a lesson that I've learned here in using these filters is when the light source is direct and very bright, you have to really be careful about where you are sort of meeting your exposure. If you need to be retaining any information in those darker areas of shadow, you really need to be careful about making sure that you're metering for those as opposed to maybe the highlights or some sort of area that's in the midpoint of those so that you get a little bit of both. Now, the sensor on my mirrorless camera that I used for these is a really, really amazing sensor. I shot these on the Canon R5, so there's a ton of detail that would be recoverable and manipulatable if I wanted to really put this sort of image through some post-processing. But comparing this to the image before, where there was a really strong sense of that contrast, I think it's really clear where this filter excels and where it finds some of its limitations. Now, that being said, the effect of the 1/8 here is much less intense than if I had had the 1/4 stop on this particular image. If I had had the 1/4 stop on this particular image, I think that it would have been pretty much a throwaway image. I don't know that I would have been able to do a lot with it if I had wanted to, if I had had that 1/4 stop. I think the 1/8 stop is probably more than enough and is already really pushing it here. One thing that I do like about this image, however, is that you can almost see the beams of sun coming through, so you can see a little bit of that on the left. So there is a very almost cinematic element of this from a lens flare standpoint. So stylistically, you like lens flares, that's something that you might be able to get out of both of these filters. But again, in this particular case, I'm looking more at the quality of the highlights, the shape and the detail available within that bloom in the center, and really the effect that it has filtering out across the rest of the image. Now, this is an interesting sort of image because I think that it really shows how nice the light can wrap around the edges of an image with one of these filters. Now, again, this is the 1/8 filter, and I think that the impact of it here is more than enough. I think the 1/4 strength would have been way too much. But if you look at the way that the highlights are sort of wrapping around the edges of those buildings and the top of this streetlight while still retaining a ton of that detail in the darkness of the pole and of the trees and the branches, I think that there's something to be learned about the way that you can potentially use this to manipulate light to soften the edges of things and give them a bit of a dreamy quality if that's what you're looking for. So what I think is interesting about the last image from this set with the 1/8 of a stop is that we've essentially doubled the light in this image. So there's a real sun and a reflected sun, and we've got this mirror image of these two women walking down the sidewalk, casting shadows, etc. And just to note that if I were to edit this photo to potentially use somewhere online or in a portfolio or something, there would be some heavy adjustments to the blacks in this because the composition of this is actually fairly nice and interesting, but the effect of having the two suns with that 1/8 of stop filter actually looks almost like the 1/4 stop that we saw in the very first photo that we looked at. So because we've doubled the amount of light, even though the filter is half the strength of the 1/4 stop, so the 1/8 stop filter is half the sort of strength of the one that we looked at in the first set, we've actually got the same effect, and that's exposure math, and I won't go into that on this particular video, but what I thought was really interesting is, again, having to be really careful to myself if I'm going to use this in situations where we've got a really strong sense of light, or in this case, even double that amount of light because there's a huge amount of that gray wash falling off into the rest of the image. And there is a lot of detail that's lost around where that sun is hitting in this image. So, again, I think that the effect here is too pronounced, but there's ways to, I think, use this in future edits that I think can be really stylistically interesting. Okay, so my impressions of the 1/8 stop filter. Generally, I find this one much more pleasing. It's also the one I've been using to film this video. I liked the effect of this on a lot of the images in the same way as the 1/4 stop was too strong with direct sort of intense sunlight or light sources. I found the same thing to be true with the 8th stop, but I could see myself using this in many more situations. It did add a really nice quality to the light in a lot of cases. It really softened the highlights, allowed them to bloom up, allowed them to wrap around edges in a way that was, in cases where the light was sort of diffused or obstructed in some way, found really pleasing. That one shot of the group of people sort of under the bridge in Central Park, I found to be a really nice shot. Now I would probably crop it in a little bit closer and still do some manipulating to just make sure that the composition was exactly right. I shot that on a 35mm lens. I was a little bit far away for the exact composition that I would probably normally like, so maybe I'll go back and try and get a better version of that in the future. But the effect of the filter on that particular shot I found to be really impactful and very, very pleasing. That would have taken a lot of work to recreate in Lightroom should I want to recreate that without the 8th stop ProMist filter. Now I did want to talk a little bit about color versus black and white because obviously not everybody shoots mostly in black and white like I do. So I took 2 images, and because I shot these in RAW, I can actually look at the color image versus the black and white image. And what I found for both of the filters, but in particular for the quarter stop filter, is that when using it for color, and yes, these images are very vibrant because it's fall here in New York, and so we've got a lot of really beautiful foliage, is that the quarter stop filter with a color image is very dreamy. It's like literally an Alice in Wonderland situation where there's kind of a haze across everything and it feels very ethereal, sort of magical in a sense. Now I could see that really working for certain types of concepts, certain types of photo shoots, specifically in fashion if it's a very high concept sort of idea. I don't know that I would use that quarter stop for any of my color work unless I were specifically looking for something like that. It really adds a very sort of light, airy, and dreamy quality to the image as compared to what that same image looks like in black and white. Now compare that with the color image that was made with the 8th stop filter, and I think that this looks a lot more lifelike. This is more pleasing to my eye. Now, I didn't really expose this correctly, to be honest. This was kind of like just a shot that I fired off when I was on my way to where I was trying to get to make the rest of these images, but as a point of comparison, I do see that, there's a kind of pleasing effect that it's having on the sun in sort of the center left, where the sun is sort of sitting in this image. But if we were to look closely at the colors on the right-hand side of the image, where these sort of branches are being illuminated and these leaves are being illuminated, I think that it looks a little bit more like what I see in real life as opposed to the extremely sharp sort of digital element that we typically get right out of photos where there's intense clarity and a lot of texture because that's coming out of sort of the computation of the cameras themselves. I actually found that there is sort of a pleasing effect here that I could see using on a more regular basis in certain types of color work, certainly in portraits, certainly in certain fashion work, but even in certain landscapes if they sort of merited it, something sort of in the summer or in the winter that, had an effect that I were looking for that was a little bit sort of airier and dreamier or a little bit softer, I could certainly see. I think that the effect here is more realistic than it was with the quarter stop, but it's probably just a question of sort of style and taste. Okay, so that's it for me this week. I had fun sort of doing this experiment. I think the quarter stop for me is probably a little bit too much to use on a regular basis, but I can definitely see how the 8th stop could be incorporated into some of my workflows. I'd be curious to hear if you use them at all, what you like, what you don't, what you thought of the video. So give me a like, give me a subscribe, you know what to do. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.